looking forward to hearing from our speaker this afternoon. I did say that perhaps his topic has changed a little bit. He said maybe a little, but I'm going to actually let Julie Scales introduce our speaker today. Julie.
Thanks, David. Very pleased to introduce to you today Dr. James Powell, who also goes by the name Buddy. Dr. Powell, or Buddy, what is your preference? I should ask that.
Everybody knows me as Buddy.
Buddy, okay. He's a native Floridian. He attended the University of Florida, where he got a bachelor's in science and wildlife biology. He got a master's in marine affairs at the University of Washington and has a doctorate in zoology from Cambridge University in England. And he's basically spent his professional career working to conserve manatees and other endangered species, and he's worked all over the world. And he's currently shows up for work at the Clearwater Marine Aquarium, and which is sustained some serious damage, but fortunately, most of the animals are survived, my understanding. And but very impressed, and we should all be very pleased that he made a point of calling us and saying that things were pretty bad down there, but he was still going to keep this appointment. So, Dr. Powell?
Thank you, Julie, for that really nice introduction. Very much appreciated. So today, I'm going to give you a little bit of a biographical sketch in terms of how I got involved, the trajectory of my career. Tell you a little bit about manatees, and then where we are sort of today with trying to protect this unique Florida species. So I actually grew up in Crystal River, Florida, just to the north of here. I actually was born in Clearwater, so really very local, native. And back, so we moved up to Crystal River in the 60s, but before that, we had sort of a fish camp up there. And back, I don't know how many of you have been there recently, but Crystal River over the course of my lifetime has changed dramatically. It's no longer crystal, with the exception of right around Springs. And Crystal River is a bit different than most rivers in Florida, is that it's almost totally spring fed rather than, runoff flowing into that river. So this photograph that you see on the right side, that's actually me when I'm about 14 years old. And that's taken in the middle of the bay in a spring out there, and right off Pete's Pier, if you've been out there. Right now, you can't even see your hand in front of you. So that just is a good illustration of the changes in the water quality. And to the right is also, to the left is myself at about that same age. And I got my start, actually it was my grandma. I owe my entire career to my grandma. And here's why. So when I was growing up, my grandma used to love to fish. And I had a little rowboat. I used to row my grandma around, and she'd fish off the back of the boat and with a cane pole. So I rode my grandma all over Crystal River. And when she passed away, she left some money to my parents and said, "Buy Buddy a boat with a motor on it," which they did. And so with that boat, kind of like a Boston whaler type boat, I could scoot around the river and just, spend my days out there. And I knew every rock, there was, because I hit most of them. So then in the late 60s, there was a guy named Daniel Hartman, who was a PhD candidate from Cornell University. And he was the first to come to study manatees. And I was out in my boat, and I would see this guy standing there with a pair of binoculars and in this little tiny aluminum John boat with a 5-horsepower motor on it. And, he didn't have a can of beer, he didn't have a fishing pole. So I couldn't figure out, what the hell is this guy doing out here? So finally I got enough courage to go up and talk to him. And he told me, he was a student and he was studying manatees, the first ever real in-depth study of manatees. So he kind of eyed me and eyed my boat, because it'd take him like 3 hours to get down the river. It'd take me 20 minutes. And we struck up this friendship, not so much because I thought he wanted this simply kid around, but he coveted, I think, my boat, plus my dad paid for the gas. And that he got a guide and he got a boat. And he was able to answer a lot of my questions because I was so intrigued by, fish and animals and wildlife. So I was his assistant, volunteer, sidekick, whatever, for the time that he was doing his work. So this is also some other photographs at the time near the spring in Crystal River. And again, you can see how clear the water was back then. These pictures were not taken in the spring itself, but also you can see all that brown vegetation. So also in the 60s, there was an introduction of Eurasian milfoil and hydrilla that just absolutely choked the river. And excuse me. So it was just a perfect place for manatees. They had plenty of food. And these springs, when they come, and I'll talk about this some more later, these springs stay at constant temperature throughout the year, around 73 degrees. So when the Gulf gets cold, relatively speaking, the springs are warm. So they come into the springs to stay warm. And then when it warms up, the springs are colder than the Gulf of Mexico, so they go back out again. So back then in the 60s, the Hartman and myself, we figured out that this was a really unique situation, Crystal River, Kings Bay, with these manatees. And so we proposed to the county commission for Crystal River to become a wildlife sanctuary, a manatee sanctuary. And this is again at me about 16, and they did a newspaper article about this initiative. There my boat with a motor on it. And the county commission, in all its wisdom, said, no way, Jose, we think it will have a negative economic impact on our community to make this a manatee sanctuary. How many of you have been to Crystal River now? And what's the driving economy up there? People coming to see manatees during the wintertime and also scalloping. So as a major, we have people coming from all over the world to come see manatees there. So Hartman also wrote an article for National Geographic, and somebody saw this article, and see this plays. Here's a video. Oops. Do you know how to get the video to play on? This goes to the next slide. Oh, dang. Well, the video I was going to play is Jacques Cousteau. And Jacques Cousteau saw this National Geographic article, and he came to Crystal River to do the first documentary on manatees. And so they got a hold of Hartman, and Hartman said, get a hold of this kid, Buddy, in Crystal River. So I ended up taking Cousteau out, spent a year with him, and Hartman came down as well. And that was the first documentary that really began to increase people's awareness about the plight of manatees and led to a state park over in Springs and really sort of kicked off a lot of the interest in the species at the time. And which has continued on. And of course, me as a 16-year-old, with spending my time with the Cousteaus was absolutely fabulous. So, and this is off of Cuba. This photograph, and this was from Columbus's log. The scribe said, when the admiral was going to Rio del Oro, he said he saw 3 manatees which came up very high out of the sea, but they were not as beautiful as they had been painted, although to some extent they were like a man in the face. Well, this is probably kind of what Columbus saw. And you can see how easy it is for them to confuse the two. So the one on the left, right? Yeah, the one on the left is the manatee. So even scientifically, the order Sirenia comes from the base word siren, which is basically another name for manatees. This, by the way, was taken wiki-washed, which we know is home of mermaids and manatees. So not necessarily mermaids, but they did have this common ancestor called a protosiren. It's kind of like a hippopotamus, semi-aquatic, would go from the land to the water, but not related at all. So it's a semi-aquatic animal. And manatees are part of this really odd group called Panicculata, meaning ancient ungulates, which includes elephants, aardvarks, hyraxes. Hyraxes are this little woolly animal, kind of like a big hamster. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but right here, it's got tusks, like these guys. And they're found in Africa and Asia. So manatees, you can see that they've got fingernails on their flippers, this sort of vestigial adaptation for once when they were on land. And their muzzle has a lot of muscles. It's like a real short trunk. It's prehensile. It can grab things. This guy's trying to, clamp onto somebody's shirt. And so, and very strong. And they have these very specialized whiskers. When I give a longer talk, I go into a bit more detail, which are like almost like a rotor for, I call it vibrissae, and they're used to help grasp onto their food and move it into their mouth. They have molars and submolars, and we call them marching molars because they have, how many sets of teeth do we have? 2. They have endless teeth. I wish I did. And so the front ones, as they wear down, because when they're eating vegetation, that grass is full of silica and sand, they wear out. And so the front teeth fall out. And then they're replaced by ones in the rear. It's this constant conveyor belt of molars. They actually, elephants, depending on the species of elephant, has 4 sets of teeth, for example. And the same sort of thing is to, as they get worn down. So manatees, this group called Sirenia that we talked about before, they're made up of 3, the trichichids, which are the manatees. There's 3 species. There's the one here called the West Indian manatee, which is made up of the Florida manatee and what was once called the Antillean manatee, which is now the name is changed to the wider Caribbean manatee because it's found beyond the Antilles. Another one in the Amazon, a separate species, and another one in Africa called the African manatee. I actually spent 10 years in Africa studying manatees and forest elephants. So right there in the heartland. And then there's another animal called the dugong, which is in a separate family, Dugongidae, and it's found in the Indo-Pacific. And the main difference, sort of physical difference between them is that it's got a flute tail, like I can't really see it here, a flute tail like a dolphin, and it also has tusks, but the tusks don't protrude, but it's inside their mouth. Manatees will, the Amazonian manatee is strictly in freshwater. The African and the West Indian manatees actually can go from fresh to salt water and stay in estuaries, which is something that's quite unusual. The dugong is strictly marine. It has a round tail like beaver, spatulate tail, which is very movable. They're completely aquatic. They don't come out like a seal or a sea lion. They're fusiform, like a torpedo shape. They have a this tooth replacement that I talked about. Their foreflippers are very maneuverable. They use them to move food into their mouth and walk along the bottom, grasp things to pull them under the water to feed on it. They have this somatosensory, which is mainly lots of hairs all over their body, which they have learned out to actually talk about in a sec. Reduced vision, but they can see contrast. They have really, really good hearing and modest olfaction and taste. They're, for the most part, completely herbivores, vegetarians. They'll eat just about any type of vegetation that they can get access to. This one is helping somebody mow their lawn. They'll eat mangrove leaves. They'll eat seagrass. But we do occasionally see manatees eating fish. I discovered it in Jamaica where they were raiding fishermen's nets and taking fish. There's even a place down in the Keys where people clean their fish, just like pelicans. The manatees actually come up and eat the fish discards from cleaning them. Kind of bizarre. And in Africa, they found in some places almost 50% of their diet is made up of clams. So they're not strictly herbivores. They mate by what's called scramble polygamy, which is essentially like a dog where a female comes into heat. She is secreting hormones into the water, and males seek her out like heat-seeking missiles. She'll go into heat for a couple of weeks and then become receptive. This was taken off of Sarasota. And sometimes she will completely beat yourself. Ladies, I mean, if you had guys following around everywhere you went for 2 weeks, you'd probably try to hide. That's what these females are doing, is they'll actually beat themselves in order to get away from these males. At some points, she's receptive and mates. Gestation is about 13 months long. They have usually one calf, but sometimes twins, about 5% of the time. And the calf will stay with the mom for about a year and a half to 2 years. This guy is probably about 2 years. I think she's ready for him to go off to college. They'll split up, and then she'll cycle back in to reproduction. Remember, these are mammals, so they breathe air, they're warm-blooded, they have hairs, and also secrete milk. This guy is nursing from the female, the nipples located in the axile of the flipper, so that's where he's clamped on. So I wanted to show you, this is what biologists do for fun. They have these hairs, which has been discovered that they have specialized nerve endings on these hairs, like a mouse has hair, these similar types of nerve endings on their whiskers. And so we believe that these hairs that are all over their body is like a sensory network, if you're from there, like a lateral line in a fish. And they're very, very, this is another video, I hope it plays. So that's one tiny little hair. And just goes to show you how sensitive it is. So like I said before, manatees, and you saw from that other map, are primarily tropical, but they are able to survive up here in Florida. It's a native species. There's a myth out there that manatees were imported to Florida for weed control. That is not true. The fossil record shows they go back millions of years. That myth probably originates from the fact that there was some news articles back in the 60s where they were caught in South Florida and put into canals for weed control. And of course, people somehow got that confused with that they were brought from someplace else. But they're able to survive up here when temperatures drop by going into freshwater springs, like up in Crystal River, to stay warm. And this photo actually shows at the mouth of the Three Sisters, which is a sanctuary. And they recently redid this area. This all became part of the National Wildlife Refuge, and because of so much erosion that was going on. But this photograph was actually taken last winter. And they'll stay around for the entire winter. They'll go out to feed, then they come back in to stay warm. And then the other place they'll go into industrial power plants and other facilities. This is at Riviera Beach near West Palm Beach. And what we do as biologists, we fly around in airplanes. This is how you'll hear each year, there are so many manatees in the state of Florida, is we count them from the air and we estimate them. So that's what we do, is take photographs like this one and then bring a bunch of them, and then go back and count them. They're actually stacked in here like cordwood. If I was to blow this up, you'd see some underneath others. So you have to sort of look for a little tail or something sneaking out. But you can also get an idea. Here's a mom and calf. Some individuals you can identify by scars. We have something that calls the MIPS catalog, which is basically a catalog, like a facial identification computer catalog, that we keep track of thousands of manatees. The estimated population right now of manatees in Florida, when I first started, we thought there was probably 1,000 in the entire state. Now we think that there's around 7,000 or so. And now in Crystal River and Homosassa River, the estimate is 1,000 manatees just in that area. So often what I do with classes is go, okay, it's like counting beans, jelly beans in a bottle. How many manatees do you think are in this picture? Somebody take a guess. More. Less than 1,000. You're pretty close. So 476 is what we have. Give or take a few. So if they don't find warm water, they succumb to what's called cold stress. And this cold stress is like you getting frostbite, is that, when you get cold, your blood shunts away from your extremities to take care of your core temperature, your essential organs. Same thing happens for manatees. And they'll get this as that blood shunts away from the surface of their skin or their nostrils. They'll get this necrotic tissue going on, this halo around their tail as well. And that actually parts of that dead flesh will fall off and they'll get this kind of scallopy tail. And if it becomes very severe, they'll actually die. And each winter we'll have, if it's a very severe cold winter, we'll have a number of manatees that die from this cold stress. The state operates a program where the people report carcasses. Those carcasses, they go out and fetch them and bring them back to several different labs, primarily one down in St. Pete, to do necropsies to determine the cause of death. So that we can track and monitor that. So we're monitoring the population. We're also monitoring the causes of death. If you remember, I told you that we keep a catalog, identification of manatees. So we have programs with a number of species, but particularly on manatees all through the Caribbean, and Belize, for example, Cuba, Dominican Republic, starting something up in Jamaica. So we're not just based here in Florida. So I was down in Cuba, where we've been working for almost 20 years. And one of my students, who's now gotten her PhD and works for us, but she was in Cuba at the time. She says, oh, there's a manatee seen near a power plant. So they took some photographs and she brought those photographs back to me. And I said, I think I know that manatee. She goes, I think you're crazy. And I go, no, it's true. So we brought it back, ran it through that catalog. And as it turns out, it was a manatee that I had photographed in 1979 in Crystal River. And this was in 2017 in 2007 that we saw it in Cuba. And since that time, we found that there are more Florida manatees have gone to Cuba. We know at least one that went to Cuba, came back again. We've had Florida manatees that have shown up in the Yucatan and have made their way around the Gulf of Mexico. So they're much broader in range than what we had originally thought. If you remember, I said they keep records in terms of causes of death. Watercraft related, I think everyone knows the story about manatees and boats, collision with boats, has remained about, in the 20-25%. Perinatal, which is more not a cause of death, but the classification is just baby manatees that have shown up dead. Cold stress, natural causes like red tide, they'll succumb to red tide. What happens is that they will inhale it at that water-air interface, particularly on a choppy day, and so that the neurotoxin will get into their brevetoxin will get into their lungs, or they'll feed along the bottom where the brevetoxin, which is it's caused by a planktonic organism that falls to the bottom, and then they'll consume that. Undetermined and unrecovered are the other categories. They'll die from lacerations from the prop, but also blunt trauma from the sort of lower unit or the hull of the boat. They'll get hit by that, it will break a bone, and that bone will puncture an organ or cause other internal damage. Sometimes you'll find manatees with barely a scar on them until you open them up, and you'll see all sorts of cracked bones and exploded organs, or a combination thereof. So this slide depicts mortality of manatees since we first started collecting data back in the 70s. And you can see that the number of manatees that have been dying has been increasing. Now, some of that can be explained because there's also been, a slow population increase. So you just have more manatees out there. But there's also some other factors that are contributing to it. And also, for example, there's more boats out there, so there's more risk of manatees being hit by them. But what I want to kind of point out here is, from a conservationist standpoint, if we know boats are slowing manatee or hitting manatees, we can kind of do something about that. You can slow them down, create sanctuaries, etc. That's kind of under our control to some extent. And so that was the primary concern. That's this orange color at the bottom, or watercraft related. But what you can see here is, proportionally, this is kind of flattened out a little bit over recent years. It's still a problem. But what you'll see here in this gray area, these gray, is quote unquote natural causes. And you'll also see that this proportion is changing related to watercraft related to all death to natural causes, that the natural causes have, and I'm saying that in quotations, have been increasing. So is it a natural cause or not? All of you know about all the manatees dying over on the East Coast, starting a few years ago. So in 1 year, we had, slightly over 1,000 manatees. That was what we estimated, 40 years ago as the entire population in Florida. And so over a couple of years, we've had a couple thousand die in that particular region. And this is, so they've been starving to death. And what is happening, and of course we rescue a lot of these animals. What happened over there is a dieback in vegetation. And you can see this very well in this photograph. So basically their food is disappearing. And what they're doing is they're coming to stay warm in that area in Brevard County, where there's a couple of power plants, and they're getting there and going, oh, where's the buffet? It's gone. So this is a transit. This is thanks to the St. Johns River Water Management District, where they've been surveying and monitoring seagrass there for years. So this is one of their transects. This is kind of before and after. And so you can just see how much of the vegetation. I have some other slides, if I had more time, that illustrate this as well. So the animals got there, by the hundreds, thousands, and found no food, and found that over the course of a couple of years. There's another slide. But what has happened is, you can see here's a time lapse. What has happened, and the green is as it disappears, that's the cover of vegetation. What has happened is that with increased nutrients flowing into that lagoon system, with limited amount of flushing, on top of that, probably climate change and warming temperatures of the water has provided essentially the perfect storm for growth of algae. Seagrass, like grass out here, needs light to grow. And so with that, those algal blooms that occurred over the course of about 10 years, one after another, is that shading, because with the algal bloom in the water column, cuts the light. And so it doesn't reach the bottom. And so that's what has happened. And so in desperation, the state actually began feeding manatees over there. And we think it has helped. Now it's kind of tapered off. There's been a lot of money that's been put into new projects. And we are seeing a bit of recovery of seagrass, but not a lot. So this kind of comes full circle around to me today, is that As a consequence of a lot of the work that was kind of started by Hartman and myself and continued on by various agencies, I'm very happy to say that Crystal River now is a national wildlife refuge, specifically for manatees. And we got it right, the county commission got it wrong, is that not only we're protecting this very unique species, but it also has contributed to the local economy in Crystal River. So a little closer to home, and also full circle for me, is being back in Clearwater, where I was originally born, is you saw those manatees in need of rescue. Well, there's something called the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, which Clearwater Marine Aquarium is part of. It's a network of facilities, and also state and federal agencies to help rescue and rehabilitate and then release those manatees back out into the wild. So my program has been responsible for tagging manatees for many years. And when I say tagging, I mean satellite tagging, because it's like if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you're in an automobile accident, says, okay, I think you're okay, let you go, come back in 2 weeks so I can check up on you. Well, manatees don't come back in 2 weeks. So we have to go out to them. So we monitor them wherever they go. But now Clearwater has become part of actually being able to, we've been involved with the rescue, we've been involved with monitoring, and now being able to take care of manatees and provide a care facility. Soon will become a critical care facility, which is kind of like an emergency room. So we just opened it up in August. And so manatees were brought to us from Zoo Tampa, which has a critical care facility. It's like an emergency room in a hospital, which is critical care. There's only 4 in the state, 3 in the state. We'll eventually become the 4th. I think I got that right. But there's also a number of facilities that house manatees. So what you do is you take the ones from the places that have the critical care to a place that can house them. And that's where we are right now. So this was last month. And we now have 2 manatees, Zamboni, and it'll come to me in a second, that were brought to Crystal River, brought to us at Clearwater Marine Aquarium, where they had been doing quite well. They were going to be released back out into the wild this winter to be monitored. But unfortunately, this is what it looks like now. That's that same pool where you saw the nice clear water. Because of the hurricane, all of our life support was inundated. All the pumps were destroyed. And so we had to actually make an emergency move to have our manatees picked up and taken back to Zoo Tampa. We also had to relocate our sea turtles to Gumbo Limbo on the East Coast. All the other facilities have really come to our aid, but we're pretty much shut down. This shows the interior and the day of, well, this is the day after, but you can see the water flooding in to all our lower floors, all the damage to our hospital. As you know, CMA is a working marine animal hospital and an education facility. The water came in with such force, like we were talking about earlier, it actually broke down doors. We were able to move most of the animals out of harm's way, and then later able to relocate those that we could not take care of. So obviously this is a pitch, we need help. Folks have been reaching out to us in terms of helping us with equipment needs and so forth, but it's still going to take some multiple dollars to get us back up and running. And so hopefully we will, in the not too distant future, be back in service again, trying to take care of and help marine animals in need. That's my story. Yeah, any questions? Yes, ma'am. Well, that's a good question. There was one named Snooty. Remember Snooty? I think many of us do, from even when we were kids. Snooty sadly died in an unfortunate accident at Bishop Museum, and Snooty was 69 years old. And we know from the way that you age manatees, they have to be dead, unfortunately. But it's the same way you do with like fish. Remember I told you, like with horses and stuff, you can look at layers in their teeth because they have that constant tooth replacement. You can't do that for manatees, and you have, big manatees that are young and small manatees that are old, depending on where they've been feeding on. So what you do is you look at their ear bones, and their ear bones, you slice it, you stain them, and they have rings like a tree. And you can count those out to an extent. And if it's a really old manatees, those rings become compressed, so you kind of lose the definition. But we have manatees that we've aged over 50 years old, wild animals, but sadly, it's probably really rare now that a manatee survives that long because they're going to get hit by something else. They're going to get red tide, starvation, hit by a boat as we impact their habitat. So they probably don't live that long, even though they could. I'll give you an example. There's at least one manatee in Crystal River that I know from when I was a kid that's still there. Yes, 15 maybe. That's, yeah. But yeah, so, so that would be 60 years. No, not close. 55 years. When I add how old I was when I first saw that man. But, so they're long-lived animals. Any other questions?
How long do they stay underwater? What's the normal?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on what they're doing. If they're resting, they'll stay under, 5 to over 10 minutes. We have some records of them submerging for longer than 20 minutes, but that's really unusual. Typically, if they're just kind of doing their thing, they're going to be surfacing anywhere between 3 and 6 minutes, whether they're swimming or feeding or whatever. But so that'd be about the average. They can actually move pretty quickly if they need to. They're also very strong swimmers. They'll be up north. They're extending their range further north. We have a study tagging them and looking how far north they're moving and what they're doing once they're outside of Florida waters. And we've actually had three accounts of manatees up in Cape Cod. And it's not that unusual to see them as far north as North Carolina and Virginia during the summer, during the warmer months. When it turns cold, they're strong swimmers, then they kind of make a beeline to get back. Sometimes they get short-stopped, like at power plants up in Georgia or South Carolina, where it's warm right then, but as the winter progresses, it gets colder and colder and colder, and we actually have to go up and rescue them and bring them back. There are a couple manatees that we've had to rescue multiple years, and maybe they're smarter than we think they are. It's like, if I wait here long enough, they'll just Uber me home again. So, who knows?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've got one other sort of treat today. We had somebody actually take me up on my offer for a member spotlight. So I'm going to call on Dustin again. We'll get Dustin twice today. Dustin, who's member spotlight, is going to tell us a bit about himself, how we can help him, and how he can help us help our community. So Dustin.
Hey friends, me again. I'm Dustin Layton, broker associate with Remax Elite Realty. As of the 16th of last month, I've been a full-time agent for over 11 years, and I was the office manager for 8 of those years as well. So I've helped many, many people buy and sell homes. I do live in Tarpon. I have an office here in Dunedin and one in Palm Harbor, so I go up and down the coast. I'm just really happy to be here. I joined Rotary to get out, get back to the community. I definitely helped a little bit. Pat and I just went a couple weeks ago and bought some supplies for Dunedin Elementary. That was fun. So if you guys ever need me, I'm always available. I got time. That's, why I'm here to give back. You guys can help me with referrals. You can send me to financial planners or attorneys. So I'm pretty easy to get along with. I'm always here for no obligation information. That's my thing. And so when it comes to real estate, put your trust in Dustin.
Yeah, Dustin, thank you very much for that. And as Dustin did, certainly feel free to sign up. Let me know if you'd like to have a member spotlight, a great opportunity for us to get to know a little bit more deeply the members of our clubs. I appreciate that very much.